Well, hey, BookTube, welcome back to the History Shelf. We are so excited today, or I am so excited today to welcome back Helena Schrader, right? I got that right.
That's fine.
Helena Schrader, who's been on this channel before at least twice. And today we are doing an author interview covering the final volume, but we're going to speak generally of her outstanding trilogy, The Bridge to Tomorrow series, and which just concluded with the final volume, Cold Victory. Wow. Uh, Helena, thank you so much for coming back on the program.
It's a pleasure to be here. I'm honored to be invited.
Oh my goodness, we love having you
All
here.
right.
Yeah, we I think we did an interview for the first book, which was Cold Peace.
No, we didn't. What we did
No?
was Moral Fiber, and
Oh,
then we did English Templar, and then we
oh,
thought,
that's the
what
two.
you?
I could have sworn that I had done another one on the
Yeah,
Bridge to
that's
Tomorrow
that's why
series.
we discussed that. Oh well, let's do them all three at once, and
Yes.
now we've got a bit of. I think there's almost too much for one, but we'll just have to do what we can.
There's a lot going on, but all I can say is I encourage, and I'm going to put up on the screen a picture of all three books.
Hmm.
I can't. I think if you add up all the pages, it's in this trilogy is probably uh, close to 1,500 pages or something like that.
Yeah, I think it's 1,000. The thing is, pages, you know how it is. It was just how what your font you use and all those kinds of
Well,
things.
true.
But yeah, yeah,
It's an
okay.
Yeah.
It
So
is.
let's just talk about Bridge to Tomorrow. It is a trilogy about the Berlin airlift. How would you like to approach just introducing well, I will say the books are very helpful in that Helena puts in the beginning, she'll give you a background, to each book, at least in the sequel, the Cold War and then Cold Victory. You kind of give a little press sheet, like, hey, this is what happened here, this is what happened there. There's a lot of history going on during that time, but yeah, if you'd like to just talk in general, like what brought you to the Berlin airlift? Why did you think it should be a trilogy? And just give us some insights into that.
Well, okay. I mentioned I actually spent 30 years of my life in Berlin, a lot of my life. So I went to Berlin after graduate school, or yeah, after my master's, and I ended up getting a PhD in German history, living in Berlin the whole time. And then the wall came down. I ended up working for the German privatization agency, the Treuhandanstalt. I went from that into venture capital in Berlin. I married a Berliner. And I didn't leave Berlin and then for until I went into the United States Diplomatic Corps. And then we left and did our tours abroad. So I spent a large part of my life in Berlin. And when I was there, so we're talking about in the um, 80s, basically, the 80s, early 90s, um, 2005 is when I left. So really 80s and 90s when I was there, as I say, when the wall came down. The Berlin airlift was still a very much in it was living memory. It
Mhm.
was not a dark, distant, historical event. It was something that people remembered very well, very closely, and had their personal experiences. Almost anybody I knew, if I asked them, they would remember the Berlin airlift either as a child or if they were older, even as as an adult. And they had memories of what they had done. They had specific memories. So it was something that was quite close. It was also, to me, it seemed like some sort of a logical topic to write about because it was an American, British, German event, if you like. The Germans were the victims. They were rescued by the British and the Americans together. And I was an American citizen. I was married to a German living in Berlin, this venue of this incredible event. And I'd written about the British Air Force because I had very close tie. Actually, I'd published by that point, a novel about the Battle of Britain, in which I'd done a tremendous amount of research with firsthand account, read a lot of firsthand accounts, and had gotten quite a lot of praise from British veterans. So sort of the RAF connection was also there. So I had sort of the three pieces of the air. And I used that to write a nonfiction book. In fact, I was commissioned by a British publishing house, a very good British publishing house. This is the History Press of the UK. The History Press in the US is different, and they asked me to write a nonfiction book that for the 40th anniversary. Is that right? It was for 2008.
Mm. Mhm.
What is that? So
Therefore,
48 to
98
the 60s.
or 40th anniversary.
No,
So,
it would have been 80, 40th would have been 88, so it must have been 60th, sorry.
oh, okay.
See how far we are. So there we are, the blockade breakers. I think you can
Oh,
see it there.
yes. Mm-hmm.
And got the children with their toys. I
Oh,
like the back cover because it shows the fog, which is a really important part of the Berlin airlift. And
mm-hmm.
that was, to write that, I ended up, as I say, I contacted various Air Force associations, Berlin Airlift associations, but also unit associations. And I ended up communicating with a large number of veterans. I was invited to one of the veterans events in Cella, which was incredible. Had lunch with some of the craziest guys you can imagine had flown on the airlift. And I actually got literally the Berlin candy bomber, the Berlin candy bomber, Halverson,
Mhm.
corresponded with me several times, sent me a hand signed copy of his book. It was amazing. There were so many stories, and this was it. So I'd written this nonfiction book, and at the time, I knew it's like there's 1,000 novels here. I don't know why there aren't more novels. When
Mhm.
I went out to try to start looking at my competition, it baffles me that there are so few novels that are set in this period because it is such an amazing story. It is a bloodless victory. It is a humanitarian effort. There's everything positive. You have a really good story. This is a good feel story. The good guys win. They overcome a horrible, adversity, but they do it all without guns. They do it with candy bars. I say this is winning a war with chocolate
Mhm.
bars and milk. And it's such a beautiful story. It's such a good story, and it's a very exciting story. So I wanted to write the novel. The issue was always trying to pick and choose between the so many stories. Um, and I don't do a good job of that. I mean,
What are you talking about?
I find it so hard to narrow things down. I mean, I end up writing, and you say, why was it 3 volumes? Well, I set out to write one book. And then I'm sitting there and I'm trying to write and I'm trying to explain well, how can you talk about the Berlin airlift until you explain why did the Russians start this blockade? Well, they did
Right.
it because of the currency problem. Well, then you have to explain the currency problem. Why was there a currency problem?
Mhm.
And then well, actually, you have to explain to people nowadays, why was Berlin in the middle of the Soviet zone in the first
Oh,
place?
right. You've got to
Because
really,
most
yeah.
people, even when the wall came down, I was living in Berlin, most people thought Berlin was on the border. No, it wasn't. It's 100 miles inside the Soviet zone. So it was really that. So I'm trying to explain the Berlin airlift. I had to explain the politics behind it. And by the time I'd written, I don't know, 200 pages, I said, this novel is going to be, as you say, 1,500 pages, and no one's going to buy a 1,500-page
Oh,
novel. So
no.
the only way to deal with the topic is to chop it into 3 pieces.
Hmm.
And therefore, I had to chop it up. And then I had to look, what are the logical places that you could break up this story,
Yes.
family historical events. It stretches so it was clear that for me, it was clear that the historical background, the politics behind why there was a blockade and how they get pushed into an airlift, which nobody thought could work and nobody wanted to do. It
Right.
was one of these absolutely default policies that ended up being right. That was clearly the first volume. So the first volume takes you into the crisis, and then this idea, okay, it's the only option. We're going to have to give it a try. Let's go out and do it, guys.
Hmm.
So that made a very good place to break off. Then the second one, it was also for me logical to take that Cold War, to
Hmm.
take that from where they start in an operation which they have a lot of doubts about, they don't really think is going to work, and they really think is just temporary, and
Hmm.
just they'll get the Soviets to the negotiating table, and you take it to the point where it's collapsing
Yeah.
because that really this did almost fail. There's a tendency in all history when we know what the results are, we forget that at the time things didn't look like that. I did this with my Battle of Britain novel. Got a lot of praise because I show how much the people thought they weren't winning, how much the
Mm.
Germans thought they were winning, how much the RAF thought they couldn't take it anymore. And they were really, really going down. And yet they felt, we can't stop, but because the cost is too high. But it was not as though they knew they were winning this battle. And the same things with the Berlin airlift. It has one problem after another.
Hmm.
And in retrospect, we all, oh, great thing, we just threw in all these plays and everything went well. No, it didn't. There were a lot of places and reasons it could have failed. And that was what I really wanted to describe in the second book.
Hmm.
So you have those two things that sort of determine. The first one really focuses on the background, the politics practically more than anything else.
Yeah.
The second one's more about the logistics, about how did we pull this off?
Hmm. Hmm.
And then the third one, Cold Victory,
Yes.
myself into this third book. And actually they solve the problems basically in January. So this starts in December when it's practically on.
Yep.
In November, they only get through, there's one day when not one single plane gets through. They are failing at the end of November.
Hmm.
And in December, it is touch and go. And by January, Tunner's been able to get, that was the US commander of the Joint Task Force, manages to get the policies implemented that he needed. And the resources finally start to flow in, and the British get control of their civilian component, and things turn around.
Hmm.
Basically, after January, February, March, April, they're just ramping up the tonnage and things are just going better and better. That doesn't make a great novel.
Yeah. Well, what
You
does?
know,
Yeah, go ahead.
so that's when I realized the third novel, we've been discussing this, is markedly different from the other two because the first two are very much history driven
Yeah.
and my characters bring history to life.
Hmm.
My character, we can get back to who they are, etc. But my characters represent multiple perspectives in the cinema, but they are personifying, they are um, you know, showing historical events more than anything.
Hmm.
And in the last one, I break a bit away from the historical timeline. And that's when I say I sort of go back behind the headlines and behind the spotlights and look at more of the psychological impact of what had happened in Berlin. And
Mm.
this is where we focus on personal stories far more than on historical events. I don't want to be a spoiler. I try to say which events are historical and which are fictional in my historical note,
Yes.
but there's no question that the third book has a different character because it's focused much more on the individual fates of anonymous and so nameless and non-historical characters. Okay.
Hmm.
Now that doesn't mean that those characters don't also represent real stories,
Okay.
but they're conglomerated, they're stories that are they're not the candy bomber in the Cold War. I have Gail Halvorson appear. I made my fictional character his co-pilot, but he really had a co-pilot. Gail Halvorson really exists. Tana really exists. Most of the first two books are about historical characters, and my characters are simply illuminating them by being in the background and being their,
Hmm.
advisors, subordinates.
Yes, I was going to say, it definitely was, having read all three. Uh, you're right. I didn't think to put it in those terms. The first two were definitely more, like you said, history driven. And the characters do animate that history and bring it to life. And then in Cold Victory, it is, you really nailed the drama, the human drama, through your characters and the stories that are going on. And I want to be careful too. I don't want to do any spoilers. But there's a lot more of the you know, the really critical moments as far as like the things that happen to these characters that you've been following over three books. And you, by the third book, and I'm just saying as a reader, you're really pulling for everyone in these novels to come out on the better side of things. And there's definitely some challenges there. And I really appreciated too how you really you honed in on the not only the experiences of the pilots and the ground crews and everyone associated with like the air ambulance service at, but you focused on the experience of women living in Berlin, and and also just the trauma that a lot of the German women you know experienced at the hands of the Soviets. Is there anything like historical, like around that period that you can speak into more about, like why you decided to really to focus on that?
I actually I just wrote a Substack actually, which will come out in a couple of weeks. And I hope people will follow the Substack about giving victims of sexual violence a voice.
Mm,
We're seeing that, of course, right now. But I think the key thing is right now, some women have had the courage to speak out, largely because they've been encouraged, and it's politically correct right now for some women to speak out. It's although it's good, the motives are largely political that have encouraged some of these women to come out against Epstein.
mm,
Um,
mhm,
in fact, most women who are sexually abused, I mean, millions upon millions, actually end up blaming themselves and hating themselves. That's what I tried to show. And therefore they do not talk.
mm,
That's been very true, of course, the victims of war, rape. They're often, actually, they're so afraid to go back, they're afraid to go back to their own homes and their own families. They expect and often are actually, again, punished and despised for being victims. And
mm,
I feel that fiction is one of the few ways we can give them voices, give them faces and voices, because they cannot do it themselves without risking that reaction from the world around them. If a woman comes out and admits what she's gone through, she will be called a whore. Not by everybody, but she will be called a whore by enough people that she doesn't want to do that.
right.
And it's just I had a friend when I was in college, a friend of mine okay. A friend of mine, she was an older student. Her daughter was gang raped. And I watched what that daughter went through. And it was horrifying to me because, as I say, she turned the hatred against herself
Mm,
instead of against her
mhm,
violators. And that just left a psychological scar. I have been I have been tormented by this thought about, and I've never had to go through it myself, by the way um, the way the system works, you abuse someone, and then because you've abused them, you despise them and call them horrible names, and you destroy them, and you destroy the rest of their lives. You might as well have killed them.
yeah.
And um, and it reappears in my writing. So one
Mm,
of my early novels about ancient Sparta
mhm,
looks at two women who are taken captive in a raid and how they then survive in the realm of captivity as slaves. And of course, the sexual abuse is a key factor. One of them is beautiful and one of them's not. In which case, the woman who's not beautiful actually has a better experience because nobody wants her.
mm, mhm,
Um, then I looked again when I was working at the Crusades in Envoy of Jerusalem, which was one of the books that received a lot of awards. I think it's one of my best books. It's very based on, it's very historically driven.
mhm,
And I made a point of including in that, and this is something that's very important in the history of the Crusades, that the Crusader states recognized actually how horrible, I mean, the capture of women, we're getting way off the subject, it was a common practice, and there were mechanisms to buying them back, and they were included in peace treaties, etc. And at the same time, when they returned, they were often scorned, they were forced to confess, they were treated as pariahs. So that idea of even though everybody realized they had no choice. I mean, it's bizarre. Anyways, so that in Envoy of Jerusalem, a major plot theme is about a woman being taken captive,
mhm,
and then coming back. Is when Evelyn does the prisoner exchange.
mhm,
And so in this one, it's the same thing. If you've lived in Berlin, if you know anything about the Soviet occupation, it is one of the most, at least it's in terms of documented cases of abuse, it is beyond comprehension. The Allied military, when they arrived in Berlin, couldn't cope with it. They were having problems even when they were there. The women were flooding Western hospitals.
wow.
And they had incidences of Soviets coming into their zones to abuse people
Oh
and
my God.
taking over entire apartment houses and just abusing women. And the estimates, it just goes on and on because although they say the number of women who were in the 100,000s, the Soviets gang raped and repeatedly raped and came back and raped again and raped again and raped again, so that any individual woman would go through 20, 30, 40 rape. So how do you measure it? 100,000 while 10?
Right. Oh
You
my
know, the number of
goodness.
rape.
Hmm.
And there was clearly, and there's talk, Americans, women started wearing armbands because our troops were so undisciplined and thought they had the right to anyone too. The difference was that it was not US policy, and we did take action against any
Mm.
claim. I'd say,
So was
I'm
that
sure a lot of
Soviet
people got away with
policy?
it, but
Is
the
that what,
Soviets clearly, boys will be boys, that's what they deserve,
and
and they
they
get
maybe
it.
encouraged that on a state, like Stalin was just like, yeah,
Stalin
that's
clearly
go do your
Clearly,
thing.
and Zhukov, the generals, and that's a right. That's our troops deserve it.
Oh my God. Well,
When you get Solzhenitsyn, some of the Russian officers talking about watching women being raped to death.
jeez,
So,
that's tough
if you
stuff.
have
Yeah.
that knowledge and then you're writing a book, I couldn't leave it out.
Right.
To me, to leave it out is distorting the historical record.
Right. It would be an
The way
injustice.
it is
Yeah.
to just hide that under a table because it's inconvenient and it's uncomfortable is something I just couldn't do. So, and then I decided, and so from when I conceived this one from the very start, as you know, Charlotte, on the very first opening page, it's we I find this fascinating. Every woman reader who reads Cold Peace knows exactly what happened to her.
Mm.
My male editor said to me, "Why doesn't she act more? Why isn't she feistier? Why doesn't she speak up more? Why,
Oh,
you say she's a countess and she's a journalist and but she's always so cowardly and she's always so cuddling and she's always frightened to speak up." And I was like,
yeah.
"Idiot, idiot." I'm sorry.
No,
And it
I
really,
get it.
because I don't actually talk about her trauma until the opening pages of Cold War. As a novelist, for me, the idea was that everyone should guess should suspect, but want to read. It's like you're keeping a little bit suspense, like when are we going to find out what really happened to Charlotte and why she did this?
Hmm.
Um, and but my editor literally read the whole book and never caught on that maybe there's a reason she behaves the way she does.
Hmm. Hmm. Also, it was a different time and a different place. And I think, modern readers or editors sometimes are like, we're in this era of like women empowerment and Me Too and all this kind of stuff. And it's just like, you put yourself in a different time and place. And women were not as encouraged to speak out. They weren't encouraged at all, uh, to be empowered.
Well,
So
there's that balance because obviously the other women, my air traffic controller Emily, as a woman pilot,
yeah,
Emily, absolutely encouraged by her husband,
yeah.
and there's no question the RAF did have women air traffic controllers on the Berlin airlift.
Hmm.
They had, I'm not inventing that. So the Second World War was a sphere in which they opened up a lot of, as always, anytime there's a crisis where the manpower is somewhere else, women get to move into those jobs. The difference was in the US and the UK. I mean, we had Rosie the Riveter, but there was much more hostility in the US, I have to say, too. In the UK, there was
Hmm.
less hostility. I, you know, that's a topic for another day. Why
Yeah.
that is, it's if whether it's because you had queens or whatever. And the RAF was the most progressive of all the services. It had
Mhm.
always been open to more other people from other backgrounds and also to women. And they did open many trades to women, except for flying, of course,
Ex-
at that point. Um, Women learned as I could fly ATA, and so Emily. So a lot of the women in the book are much more independent and confidence, etc. But yeah,
yeah.
let's
Well,
just. I think we need to do another topic.
yeah, no, for sure. That kind of brings in my other question was just about how long did it take for you to kind of and how did these characters come to your mind? Like how did you, because just for the viewers at home, there are so many wonderful characters. And in fact, I'll say it again, I love that my blurb is on the front of this book.
Well
The
deserved. Well deserved.
Thank you. The War and Peace of the Berlin Airlift, because you have such and of course you've got cast of characters in the beginning. So the books are all very friendly to getting you up to speed and who all this broad cast of characters you have. But for men and women, and yes, you're right, there are balanced stories. There are so many, all the women are strong in the series. They have different things that happen to them, but it's such a refreshing thing to see women in roles of, being pilots and being co-equals with their male counterparts. But how did you draw up this list of characters? And if you can talk about like just even some of your favorites.
I have to divide the characters up. All right, but can you get me? I'm getting unstable messages here. I hope we don't break down. Okay. There's the historical characters. So General Cunner, General who was the head of the U.S. Joint Task Force, Ernst Reuter, the mayor of Berlin.
Mhm.
Many of these characters are given to me. General Clay, our U.S. governor, General Robertson, the British governor. These are real human characters, so they're of course pre-given. They have to be there for me because I try to be historically accurate. Then the next set of characters were characters that I've written about before. So Robin and Emily are the hero and heroine, or two of the two heroes and heroines of my Battle of Britain book. Very strong characters who I love dearly. And after I wrote that, I always knew that they continued. They didn't, I knew that they had a life after 1940,
Mhm.
I was conscious of that. And the same thing happened with Kit and his crew, which ends even more, well, in both of the war books ends basically in the middle of the war. Not Kit, okay. Battle of Britain book ends in the September 1940. And
Mhm.
so there's a whole war ahead of them. And Kit and Georgina's story the Kit and his cruise ends with the victory, or virtually with the victory in Europe. But there's life after that.
Yep.
I'm sorry, that was a spoiler for both books.
It's okay.
Yeah, there's other, yeah, not everybody sweats, but okay. And so writing about the Berlin airlift was very much where this is something that they could have taken part in, and it was fun to bring them back and show you to be able to continue their story to show, okay, because with Kit's crew, you talk about the unemployment and his crew having trouble getting their feet on the ground, and Kit, of course, is handicapped now. He's lost a leg, and trying to get a job in that environment. And it was wonderful to be able to bring him into a real aspect of the Berlin airlift, and that is the British opened up the part of the airlift to civilian companies.
Mhm.
And you get all sorts of ragtag companies, people with just one plane, including, people who later had larger airlines, getting it on the airlift, getting their getting off the ground, getting the companies off the ground on the airlift. And some of them totally incompetent and bad and terrible, but Bennett and anyways, we don't want to get into that. But so it was fun. It was a logical thing to have Kit with the civilian outfit, and that enabled me to have Emily flying with because the RAF did not allow women to fly in this period,
Mhm.
although they had women in the reserves who were flying pilots.
Mm.
Um, which is why you have Emily. She's voluntary reserve. She has an RAF rank, but they were not actually flying at the time.
Right.
And whereas the civilian outfits could, they had no restrictions on them. So it was a great way of talking about a really unique for the airlift reunion. Most of the pilots and navigators I met were from the civilian, and they were crazy. They were absolutely crazy. Of course, wartime pilots, but then there's in a small outfit, a bunch of guys getting very, very drunk a lot of the time,
Mhm.
doing a lot of crazy things. But anyway, and that was just it was really that's where the next bunch of characters come from.
Mhm.
And then it's sort of fill in the blanks. So what do you want? What did I feel was necessary to describe for people to understand the airlift as a whole? And clearly I needed a German perspective. I needed two German perspectives.
Mhm.
I needed someone who could talk about the official Berlin, the city government, because the city government of Berlin plays as much a role in this airlift as the Allies if the Berlin city government had not been in favor of the airlift, if they would have preferred Soviet rule, we would have pulled out.
Mm,
Despite what Truman said, the bottom line was we were not going to go through this whole thing if they were rioting and saying, Yankee, go home and
right.
down with the British Empire. We would not have spent the millions and lost the lives we did. We would have pulled out.
Wow.
And but they didn't. The Berlin government was absolutely staunch, even when we were wavering in September of 1940,
Hmm.
48, we came close to doing a deal with the Soviets. It would have been a disaster. And it was because the Berlin government, and they called out and they had the rallies and they called us out and said, listen to us, don't bargain. Don't sell us down the river. The
Yeah.
Berliners are out here suffering, and we're doing this conscious. You can do not look at this city. It's very, very famous. Schau auf diese Stadt. And therefore, I wanted a character who could represent what that was, who was in the Berlin government at that time. And what's very important is who was in it. They were the Social Democrats. It was the people who had been against Hitler from since before he came to power. And
Right.
I wanted to show that. I wanted to show to your reader, not all Germans were Nazis. I
Right.
wanted there to be characters who represented those men who'd been in concentration camps. And that's why my character, Jakob Liebherr, is a social democrat who's gone and spent his time in a concentration camp, and now he's trying to represent Berlin, and he's facing former socialists and realizing, and now we're facing the communists who are out trying to do the same thing to us that the Nazis tried to do.
Right.
And very strong character. And I didn't have to imagine much, because if you know these people, and I've known these people, have met these people,
Hmm.
not, he's obviously the conglomerate I pulled together from Jakob Kaiser and from Labor, Julius Labor, men who died in the resistance, but whose positions and whose life, like Willy Brandt. I mean, these social democrats that were very, very staunch Democrats, and they make they're strong. They're just wonderful characters, and it's easy to write about them. And then I had his son be more communist, so that you could have that point of view then introduced.
That little tension.
Um,
Yeah.
Charlotta, from the start, as I say, was there to represent the women who had been abused. Charlotta's purpose was to be the spokeswoman of the women. And I don't know. Again, all my characters come to me basically inspirationally. I can't sit down and write a resume or something. I realize I need something, and I think about it. And anyway, so it was clear to me she had to be fragile. And yet she had to be someone. She had to be someone that could get involved in the plot. I mean, you had to bring her in. She had to be educated enough. There had to be some way that she could get involved with the other characters.
Hmm.
And that was by being first the German teacher to Emily, and then getting involved in helping, get information, and then being hired by the company. So that was clear. So who else is who? Yeah, okay, and then there's Kathleen. Kathleen, I
Kathleen.
wanted for the air traffic control, because we're about this. The air traffic controllers always, I think, always, like ground crews and air traffic controllers, are the unsung heroes of every aviation story. Nothing would have functioned without air traffic control or ground crews. In my Battle of Britain book, I focused really hard on the ground crews and on the control room.
Hmm.
And here's the same thing. I didn't do the ground crews here, but I did focus on, although there's some ground crew, but I did focus on the air traffic controller. And I love the fact that women had women air traffic controllers. So that just seemed to me a logical, you know, addition to the cast.
Hmm.
And then, of course, there was the big elephant in the room, which is the Americans carried more tonnage. So how can you have a book about the airlift and have no Americans?
Right.
And and the story of the Berlin candy bomber, I mean, Gail Halvorson, the candy bars and the parachutes, is beautiful. It's just,
Yes.
you can't write about the airlift and not include that. So that's when I decided, okay, I have to have an American who's with the candy bomber, who can be my, window, or, the way of looking and describing that. Because
Get a
I don't
view.
want to write
Yeah.
Halverson's story. He's written his story. There's great things about him. I didn't want my character to be Halverson, but I wanted him to be part of the effort, and I'd be able to describe it. And once I decided on JB, my uncle was a pilot. He was a navigator. Always went by JB. And I grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Ypsilanti was where my sister was. It was it just had to be. It was that whole Michigan
Had to be from
season
Michigan.
in Michigan. Once I said I needed somebody, I swear a ghost said, look, fine, that's me. I want to be
I loved it.
that, you know, and just, and JB is just JB. He's sort of like Robin. There's some of the characters, you just can't control them. They come out with things I could never think of in my, wildest drunken rampage, because they're just guys and they think differently than I do.
Right. Well,
And
you definitely got in there and the heads of some of these pilots, which I appreciated, and that kind of leads me into my next question. Um,
okay.
all right, so my next question then, kind of following up on that, is the novels are so detailed in the aspects of flying, um, you know, takeoff and landing procedures. I mean, you're very detailed, and I know some of your background, but for viewers, just kind of new to this and new to you, can you tell us about your experience with aviation and how do you know so much about just everything?
I've had very, very little experience in aviation. I've flown a lot in my life. I love it. I've read about it. This is really more research than anything else. It's
Wow.
reading firsthand accounts. It has to do really mostly reading and listening to of oral history. I have had flying lessons. I did do
Mhm.
some flying, but I never got qualified, so I can't,
Okay.
pretend that I'm a great pilot or anything. That may help. I don't know. I have relatives who flew, but mostly it's just plain the hard work of reading. I'm going to say the right sources, because it's largely reading firsthand accounts,
Mhm.
autobiographical works. Also some of the one of my best. Okay, this was actually from Moral Fiber. There are wartime films which were done are live or real. Like the RAF had reporters on some of the missions with the
Mhm.
crews. You can get the recordings of those,
Oh,
and
wow.
you'll get the act get the the final the checks. They're on saying fuel tank 4, that's bump bump bump. The exact I would I would transcribe those and then actually edit them down so that you had a very realistic final check before takeoff kind of stuff.
Wow.
But most of the things I describe, I'm in terms of flying, in terms of crashes, in terms of issues with air traffic control or whatever, are based on accounts I've read. So they may be at a different time, or the characters obviously are my characters instead of the real characters. But I don't invent a lot of flying precisely because I'm not a pilot.
I see. Well, I can tell you as a reader, I felt like I was like, wow, this is like a pilot talking over here. Um, that's really impressive. Just from hard, just cracking the books and researching it. And like you said, transcribing those recordings. Speaking of research, can you tell us like how and like you said, you lived it, you were in Berlin and you kind of by maybe osmosis, you just kind of, took in a lot of that history, but how much research for this series did you really put in? Like how long did it take you?
The key is that having written a nonfiction book about the Berlin Airlift,
Well, that was it,
when
right?
I had so much, and for that, I did so much primary research. As I said, I did a lot of interviews, and I had people write me. I have a full file full of letters written by airlift participants, not all pilots, some of them,
Mhm.
navigators, ground crews, as you say, controllers, everybody. But I collected an awful lot of primary material. I had more material than I could possibly use. The problem was more paring it down and making sense of it, because it's easy if you have a lot. In fact, that may be the weakness. This airlift book is my best-selling book. Okay, the nonfiction book has sold well over 8,000 copies, which for a nonfiction book is really outstanding. In fact, it's for anything, it's outstanding, frankly, if you know what the statistics are. So, and But it's got all sorts of I tried to put everybody. So I'd take a topic and then everything anybody written to me about, I would put into that. And you can't do that with a novel. You can't tell everything. You can't tell every story and every joke. You
Yeah.
have to give it a structure. You have to pare it down. So
Hmm.
it was more about, as I say, structuring the information I had than getting new information.
Gotcha. So the structuring, I'm just curious as from a writer standpoint, how do you like do a big chart? Do you have like a whiteboard or how do you kind of do that? Just the structuring, or do you kind of silo it? Like, okay, this is book one. I know my start, my end date. These are going to be the major events, and then go from
That's right.
there.
I do. I start with, I have an outline. I have a relatively, I start with history. So the outline is chronology.
Okay.
And then I put the characters in that chronology, if you can see what
Okay.
I'm saying.
Yeah, I do.
So 1947, the first chapter, the baseline chapter of Cold Peace, I introduce my characters and it's what's going on in their lives at the after 2 years of war. It's 2.5 years after, victory in Europe
Hmm.
and what's happening and the situation they're in. And then you get to the to January of 48, and it's there's the foreign ministers conference is going on and the clashes with the Soviet the Union is going on, etc. And then you say, well, what's happening with my characters? And it's like, this is when, okay, Robin arrives in Berlin and he's going to get the briefing on what's happening. So he gets the political briefing. And then we get the, Charlotta's cousin arrives. Incredible, very important issue for her. Great. And all, he's also a character from one of my earlier books. So Christian and
Christian.
Alex.
Oh, yeah. I love Christian.
And Alex, the lawyer, are both from my book on the German resistance.
Oh
So
my gosh.
and then so the outline starts. They're basically bullet points of what's happening in the character development. Are the characters doing chapter by chapter? So the chapters are like the historical time frame. And then the bullet points becomes for each individual character, what is happening in their lives.
Mhm.
I then ended up writing the characters. I didn't write it chronologically. I wrote all the JB scenes one after another, practical, in other words.
Mhm.
Or I would write the Robin scenes. I would write, now some of them overlap. I mean, obviously Charlotta and David, a lot of the time they're together at the same places. But I found that to make sure that the character arcs and make sure their development worked, I had to write their stories what through,
Mhm.
and then weave them back together with the other characters. So
Mhm.
that's what I did with this one.
Mhm.
Um, and I actually had JB in the first book, and then I was advised by my test readers that that was just going too far out of the context, and they didn't like that.
Oh.
Meant I lost some really nice material I liked about Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti. So anyways, I had to cut stuff. The
Oh,
same thing with
darn.
Anna. I tried to introduce Anna in Cold War,
Yeah.
and it didn't work. I had to take her out. But I could do that because in effect I'm writing the strains. I'm trying to make sure that the character stories, if I only wrote about that one character, that story would still make sense.
Hmm. Yeah, and I love that you introduced Anna in well, like
Cold
you said, you
Victory.
tried to get her in Cold War, but in Cold Victory, Anna Savage,
Yeah.
she is an African American nurse from
Right.
Georgia. And so you kind of start with her there, and then she kind of gets this opportunity. Um, I just love how I was like, oh wow, brand new character, and I love how she was. Then you kind of inserted her into the story. And just for the viewers at home, the series, it covers the high, it covers the history of the Berlin airlift, but within the story itself, it's about um, Robin, the wing commander, right, at Gatto. Is it Gatto?
Yeah.
Gatto.
Yeah.
And but then you have like David Goldman, who is he's a Jewish, he's a businessman, right? And he stands up this emergency air services, right? The air ambulance, and then Emily gets involved. So not only is it about the cooperation between the British and the Americans in flying in supplies. But I loved how in Cold Victory too, you talked about the evacuation
Yeah.
of the injured.
That and
And
those are true. Those are all those statistics are absolutely rule that one of the reasons that the British were bringing in fewer supplies is they took the time to take people out
yeah.
and to take products produced in Berlin out, which meant they had to stay on the ground and not only offload but reload, and that reduced their turnaround times and it reduced the number of overall flights. But
Mhm.
these things are absolutely critical to morale. And
Mhm.
it's an issue. That's an issue I feel strongly about too. The idea that it wasn't all about tonnage, why they called him tonnage Turner, because he was so focused on the absolute efficiencies, but not. He seems sometimes lost track of the human factors.
Yes, which you wonderfully captured in the book because just yeah, the humanity aspect too. It's just like there were sick children, there were sick, people who
Mm,
couldn't get the proper care in Berlin.
yeah,
And so yeah, I
and
love there was
nutrition.
that dramatic turning point where, Robin has to make a decision. Do I that could affect his career, Um, do
Yeah,
I take these orders or do I and
get
evacuate
around.
them over the yeah. So there was so much of that going on too. That's just the dramatic personal choices that I really enjoyed as well.
Yeah, moral courage is a recurring theme in all of my books, sir.
Yes. Thank you for bringing that up again. Just going back to your book, Moral Fiber,
Yeah,
it's a
very much.
major theme and it plays in all of these books, Cold Peace, Cold War, and Cold Victory, which I think are just a perfect summation of like what you're looking at in each book, the very cold peace, then it's war, and then the final victory. Um, can you tell me like who are your favorite characters that I mean, I know I've got some of mine. I love all of them
Oh,
really.
I'd like to know that. That very much it. Okay, I mean, let's
Eh,
say Robin and Emily are characters. Robin is a very powerful character who has been, he's also in the book I'm writing now. Um, Kit was somebody, as I say, I was planning to write the Berlin Airlift trilogy, or I thought it was going to be one book of that, but I was planning to write about the Berlin Airlift, and then Kit stopped me and said, no, you have to tell my story first. So, I put everything on hold and wrote Moral Fiber. Kit's an incredibly powerful character. I love them both.
mhm.
Um, but as say the other characters play an important role. I think Jakob Liebherr is so important for doing what he does, and I think Charlotte, as I say, is a voice for the victims, and I think um, I liked Anna, of course, otherwise I wouldn't have put her in there. And
Oh yeah.
yeah, basically, I like all my characters. That's why I write books.
Well, yes, and you did. This was just a smorgasbord of characters. That's why I called it the War and Peace. There's so many. Um,
Mm.
I know that my personal, well, I really loved everyone for just the different things they brought to the table, but I was always very deeply invested in the David and you pronounce her name Charlotta, right? That's the
Charlotte is the German
is the
pronunciation. Lotte
German.
is often the short, but it's Charlotte. I mean, fine.
And
Yeah.
yeah, and
I'm glad to hear that.
yeah, that love story was something else. If even without giving anything away, but I mean, it's just like you got into the psychology of it because in David, you explore, how you know, German Jews, right? Or
Yeah.
just Jewish people in general who were there, what they had to contend with, and he had his own personal insecurities about it, like with and Charlotta is a countess, and so, but like you said, people are assuming that every German was a Nazi, which was not true. And that's what I think the most powerful aspect of your books on the Berlin Airlift is that it just humanizes the Germans, the conquered German people. Um, and by the end of Cold Victory, I just felt like my heart was really just so full because it shows how the German people just, they were like, no, we got rid of this tyrant, this dictator, this madman, and we want to turn away from Stalin. We actually want to become more Western and
Yeah,
democratic. And so that was very clear. And it's like within the airlift and at the end of it, you see how the modern German nation, right, after the
yeah.
war, came to embrace just your Western ideals and democracy. And I thought that was, and it kind of set the stage for everything that would happen later. Um, but it's a really accessible way for people who to understand that era and to know how people went from a defeated Germany to a country coming together and rebuilding.
And I also I do want to stretch what is important is that this is not an apology for Nazism,
Oh no.
because heroes of the Berlin Airlift, the real heroes, as I say, in Germany, Mayer Reuter and the people on his, they were the opponents of Hitler.
Mhm.
This was a time when, first of all, Berlin never voted for Hitler by majority. Berlin was called Rote Berlin, Red Berlin. It was traditionally and known for being left.
Mhm.
It's sort of like New York, okay? It's sort of like the New York. It was always had a more left-leaning population. Yes, Hitler took over. Yes, it was his capital. But yes, there were a percentage of the population, as there is in New York, who were fascist.
Yeah.
But the majority really had a very strong left leaning, which is why the Soviets assumed that Berlin would be open to a Soviet. They were shocked when they realized that although they were socialists, they weren't putting up with the tyranny that went with the Stalinism. And though, so as I say, and also I tried to bring out in Cold Victory that our policy of collective amnesty, like our policy of collective guilt switches to collective amnesty, meant that some of the Nazis came back into positions, particularly in the judiciary. That is true. It's one of the things that my German friends see. I wrote about the German resistance, so I knew a lot of people who had been anti-Hitler throughout the whole period, and their wives and their children, and they were outraged by the amount of Nazis who were allowed to get back into positions of power in West Germany.
Mm.
That's something to try to address in that cold victory. When I call it cold victory, it's because in our haste to set up a West German state, we didn't have we had a very intensive denazification at the beginning in the time when we didn't recognize, we failed to recognize and take use of many people who were anti-Nazi. And then we had a much too rapid amnesty, which allowed some of the Nazis to come back in. It is a complex picture. The book is not about whitewashing the Germans. At the same time, it does try to honor those who were at that time, as I say, in Berlin and obviously my theme of the German resistance. So Christian and Alex, of course, are favorite characters because I know them so well. And then
Mhm.
I like people like Yasha. I had to put Yasha in.
Yeah,
Oh, and if
sure.
you ask who's my absolute favorite character, it's Mila. So she was
Really?
another one of these characters who comes to me totally out of nowhere because I had to have and this is it's based on a firsthand account by a defector from the Soviet apparatus. And he talks about one of his colleagues. So he was a man, about one of the Soviet women who hero of the Soviet Union,
Yep.
partisan, who falls in love with a Western
Oh,
officer.
yeah.
Now I changed that story. It is that she doesn't, as everyone,
Yeah.
it's not a spoiler. In this book, she plays a slightly different role. But the fact that there were these young women, they were the partisans. They were sharpshooters, and
Yeah.
they were terror of the Germans, and they become heroes for the Soviet Union. But they'd actually lived in a almost a Soviet free zone because as partisans, they weren't so much under Soviet control.
Hmm.
And as I say, particularly for the Ukrainians, so the war started, and I just thought, yes, I want to have a Ukrainian hero in here that shows a different side. I didn't feel comfortable about writing a Soviet character. It might have made the book better if I just didn't feel I could do that. I didn't have the sense of I didn't feel I'd done enough research. I didn't feel I couldn't. It would have taken a huge amount of research. It would have taken a lot more sympathy, a lot more empathy for a position. It was one bridge too far. I wasn't going to do that.
Bridge too far. Yeah. Um, I'm curious because this will lead into my, one of my concluding questions, but and you mentioned how like Robin is in the book you're writing now. Are we going to see, would Mila ever show up again somewhere or
No,
no?
no.
Okay, but
But
she
I
was
know
a
what
wonderful.
happens to her. She and oh, we're getting spoilers. She's
Okay,
gonna grow fat and old together with
with someone.
with someone.
Well, that's good for her too, though. That's a fine ending. Uh, so let's see. We've covered a lot. Is there anything that you feel like someone new to the series should know from the outset? I think just knowing that it's very
Well, I
historically.
don't, you have to read all three. I do think it's better to read all three. But I know some people are totally intimidated by this idea. It's strange because every publisher and agent and everybody out there and book promoters, everything, series, right? Series, right? Series. And yet when you ask readers, they say, oh my God, not another series. I don't
Uh,
want, I don't want to feel like if I read one, I have to read 20.
hmm
I get that.
hmm
Um, and I think certainly Cold Victory can be read entirely on its own. I don't think you have to read. I also think Cold War can be read on its own because Cold War is more that clear piece, the airlift, start of the airlift trouble. But
Right.
it covered it's in a
Yeah.
way it's a very clear, I think Cold Peace is hard to read on its own because you realize you've just started something and you're going to feel like, wait a minute, this doesn't end. This book, there's no end to this.
Yeah. Yeah.
Ultimately, Cold Victory is the one that's easiest to read something where you start a little bit in the middle, but you come to a satisfying end, than to read something where you get started and then you say, it's not
Yeah.
really over yet. But if you're more interested in the pure logistics and the candy bomber and the airlift, Cold War covers that.
Cold War. Yeah. Hmm.
And if you're more interested in Cold War politics, then Cold Victory is much more about the politics.
Well, that's a helpful tip then for folks out there to know that you could, definitely pick up Cold War, Cold Victory, and just dive right in, and
Mm.
you'll enjoy it. I'm just going to say, it's from my personal experience, um, like when you say series, I feel that way about like mystery series that go on for 20 books. And if you're just now coming to it, you're like, do I have to go back and read number one? That's ridiculous, right? But with a trilogy, it seems much more doable. You know what I mean? It's 3 books. And boy, it's a journey. It's a journey of the mind, the heart, and it's just this historic, sweet. I wish people wrote more trilogies, frankly, because you really get that investment with the characters, and you see just an incremental evolution more than if it happened in one book. So I can see both arguments, and I just enjoyed all three as a piece, but
Yeah,
definitely.
I like, we get right down to it. I think you can do a thriller in one book, but anything which is truly character driven, you could also do a character-driven book in one if you're looking at a very small issue. I always say, that's something that could be made into a movie. You're only looking at one issue. The
Mhm.
minute you have multiple characters and a complex historical background, it requires more for you to be able to give characters the depth that they need to be good characters
Mhm.
in a historical environment which is complex. I don't think you can do it well in a single novel.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. So now that the trilogy is complete, I mean, how do you feel about it being over?
No, no, it's
Yeah,
very painful. It's really, I was in August of last year, which was when I finished writing Cold Victory. Then it still had to go through multiple editing processes
sure.
and the whole formatting and marketing, etc. But Cold Victory, basically, I'd written the first 2 drafts by the end of August last year,
Yeah.
and I just felt empty.
Oh,
It's like I really would like, I'm not ready to stop. I'm not really just ready to leave these characters. And I'm not, and
hmm.
yes, I knew what would happen. And then I had people writing suggestions, well, you could do this with them, you can do that with it. And I'm just like, I'm gonna run the Cold War. That's not, I don't feel this was it. The Berlin, as I say, Berlin blockade and airlift, I really knew Berlin. It was something I cared about. But I'm
Hmm.
just not into Cuban Missile Crisis. And I don't know. I don't, it's I don't know, the Vietnam War, it's not me.
Right.
And every writer has to, every writer has to write, you have to write what's in you, not what's in other people's mind.
Well, that's
So
right. Hmm. So
I knew.
I know I figured it would be a bittersweet answer. Like it's like you've 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 closed the story up, you tied it up with a bow, but having to say goodbye to, you live with these characters, they
That's
were
right.
in your heart and mind for, every day. So now I'm very curious now. What are you working on now, if you can share? And where are you at in the process? I know I've asked you that in our last interview, but
So I've gone back, as I said, I can't go forward. I just don't feel Cold War isn't so much. And I've gone back to Malta, the Siege of Malta, the Basalt and Siege of Malta in 1942. Malta is an island the same size as the island I live on here. It's basically, I think it was 14 miles by 7 miles. But it's about 100 square kilometers that are 100 square miles, whatever. You can look it up. I have to
mhm.
look at it. And it was they bombed more than any other place on Earth, basically, in the Second World War. It was more heavily bombed in the month of April than London was in the entire Blitz.
And who did the bombing?
Um,
Just so for our viewers.
the Germans and the Italians jointly.
Okay.
Okay, now the Italians started it all because as soon as the French surrendered, the Italians decided, oh, the Germans are gonna win this war, and we want to get our hands on everything in the Mediterranean. So I mean, oh, Nostra. So they attacked. They sent the first bombing raid against Malta on, I think it was the 10th or the 11th of June, 1940.
Hmm.
And then there was a period, then you have these periods where the Germans come in, like from the beginning of 41 till June of 41, the Germans come in, and the Germans are always much more efficient than the Italians. They do much more damage, and they almost break it, and then they are pulled out to go to the Eastern Front when Hitler invades the Soviet Union. So then the Maltese start to recover, and Malta is an unsinkable aircraft carrier. You have to understand, Malta is halfway between Alexandria and Gibraltar and
Hmm.
halfway between Sicily and Libya.
Okay.
It's only 60 miles south of Sicily. It
Oh.
was a base of the Royal Navy since the time of Nelson. The Royal Navy had, it's a major port in the Mediterranean for the Royal Navy. Isn't Queen Elizabeth, didn't Prince Philip or whatever, marry their first tour, whatever.
I think
Anyway,
so.
Malta was always important to the Royal Navy from the time of Nelson. And now in the Second World War, it is vital, absolutely vital. They pull their fleet back. They pull the Mediterranean fleet, which used to be based in Malta, back to Alexandria because they have so much they dealt with that they can hold Malta. At the same time, as I say, Malta's halfway between, and Malta becomes well, they have a submarine flotilla. They actually have a surface ship task force, and then they have RAF offensive bombers and torpedo bombers, and they choke Rommel's supply line. In December of 1941, they come close to they basically sink 90% of the ships the Germans sent across the Atlantic.
Oh. Hmm.
Rommel is saying, I cannot continue fighting. I either, this is it. Hitler throws another group, he sends back the commander from the Battle of Britain, one of his Luftflottes, and the RAF ramps up this assault in the spring of 1942, which comes very close to breaking Malta. The British governor of Malta okay, don't get me on the dates, end of May, says that if he does not get supplies, the British can't get supplies to them. The problem is Malta is a small island. They're dependent on imports of food, everything, of course, fuel for the aviation fuel, bunker fuel for the ships, and everything they eat, drink is basically except water is being imported, and the Royal Navy can't get the merchant ships through.
Mm.
They're losing them because, say, the Italians control Libya and Tunisia, the
Hmm.
North African coast, and they control the northern coast of, northern France, Italy, Sicily, and they're taking anyways, the governor eventually reached the point where he says that he will have to support these are civilians and he cannot watch them starve. They're down to rations and public feeding, and
Mm.
if they don't get a convoy through by the end of August, he will surrender Malta.
Oh, wow.
He's a British Lord Gort. He was the commander of the British Expeditionary Force.
Hmm.
And the Royal Navy sends, they send 4 aircraft carriers, I think three aircraft, 4 battleships, I don't know how many cruisers, unlimited numbers of destroyers, and they try to fight a convoy through, of which, so why don't I have these figures in my head? I think it's 5 out of 14 ships survive.
Wow. Wow.
One of the ships that survives is actually sinking, has already sunk, has been abandoned twice. And she comes in with a destroyer on either side of her, and a destroyer pushing her, and a destroyer leading her.
Wow.
She's dragged into the harbor half sunken.
Wow.
But it's enough for Marl to keep fighting.
Mhm.
That's the historical base. So I want to write a novel about this.
This is fantastic. And
And
from the viewpoint of the British, obviously, or
obviously,
yeah,
not
obviously.
not this, not the Germans.
Not the
Oh,
Germans, no.
yeah.
But the Americans didn't have anything to do with Malta, right?
Had
I'm
nothing
not,
to do with
yeah,
it.
okay. Okay. Well, and
So
so that's where maybe you're saying that Robin might be, he is a part of
that's
that.
Robin's back in the
Robin
book.
Priestman, ladies and gentlemen.
But Emily's not, because it's an unaccompanied tour. Women didn't go to Malta.
Okay, all right. So this is
It's just Robin on a tour. I also want that the convoy ultimately becomes the saviors of Malta. So I want in this book, it's not a book, it's going to be 2. I don't think it's going to be 3. If you like, if you like trilogies,
a
I can't
duology.
do this in one book again. But there's a storyline is the Merchant Navy. The Merchant Navy is the most underreported, underappreciated service of the Second World War. The
Wow.
British Merchant Navy took 27% casualty rates. They lost 27% of the men fighting on merchant ships,
Wow.
sank. 38,000 men sunk at sea.
Mm,
They were non-combatants. Um, and of course, they say that ultimately it's the convoys that convoy that saves Malta, and it is merchant ships that do it. So I wanted to have a merchant navy storyline. So I have a whole line that's a new character, and in the first book he's just on merchant ships. You're going to see the North Atlantic, the Moormask, and independent, sort of sailing what it was, merchant ships in the Second World
oh,
War. And the
great.
second birth, he's then assigned to one of the ships that will be in that convoy, not the tanker, not the famous Ohio. The tanker was a U.S. ship, by the way, but with a British crew.
Okay.
But she was one of the most modern tankers in the world, one of the fastest, because convoy had to be fast to get through. And anyway, so he's on one of the other ships in that convoy. And I will not do the spoiler of telling you it's one of the ones that gets sunk or not. But that's one storyline.
Okay.
Robin is the head chief of intelligence. Now, as you can imagine, being where they were, Malta was the first place outside of Britain that got um, the X machine, which deciphered Enigma. So we've all
Mm,
heard about Enigma and the German code, and there's a place called Bletchley Park where they had these machines and where they worked out how to break the codes. They was not the only place. Malta was one of the other places in the world that had one of these machines.
okay.
And we also, everybody hears Bletchley Park and they all think of all of that, but you forget the fact that though they were decoding messages that somebody had to hear first. And that was the Y service. The Y service was heavily manned by women. So,
Woman.
and Malta, 60 miles from Sicily and 100 miles from Leba with Rommel in the den was a major listening point in both German and Italian for what was happening in the desert, and a lot of those signals, they did, as I say, they did their own deciphering rather than sending them back to Bletchley Park, back and forth
Mhm.
and back.
Wow.
It would have been intercepted doing that. So the intelligence thing. So Malta was an unsinkable aircraft carrier in terms of it was an offensive weapon. Because it was offensive, the Germans were attacking it, which is why then the defensive Battle of Malta is very, very famous. They started with 4 biplanes. When the Italians first attacked, they had 4, but because one of them had to be cannibalized to keep the other 3 flying, there were never more than 3 of them in the air at one time. So
Mhm.
the Maltese population called them Faith, Hope, and Charity.
Yeah.
One of them is now still in the museum at Fort Alamo. They did get hurricanes very rapidly, but they didn't. The governor, the first governor of Malta, didn't recognize the difference between hurricanes and Spitfires, didn't insist on having Spitfires. When the Germans redeploy in 1941, they can do climbing rolls in front of the hurricanes and just say, ha ha.
Right, right.
And because they're based in Sicily, all the bombers coming in have complete fighter escort. It's like the Battle of Britain all over again. These are
Mm,
not like our bombers going over Germany without a fighter escort and getting torn out of the skies. These
mhm.
guys are coming over with complete fighter escorts, and the fighters are much better than the British fighters, which are old, bunged up old hurricanes that have been sent out from Britain after fighting for two
Right.
years. They came very close to losing that battle. That happens a bit earlier. They finally turn it around and they have to fly the Spitfires off her carrier decks. I mean, the Spitfires are too big to go under the decks. They have to go on the decks of the carriers. Spitfires were never designed to be flown off a carrier deck. They do not have the range from where the Royal Navy could not risk. At first, you feel like the Royal Navy's not doing their job, like they could have taken them closer, until you realize that they couldn't take an aircraft carrier to Malta and get back because they didn't have enough fuel on Malta to refuel an aircraft carrier.
Mhm.
Not so much. Anyways, things, it's a domino effect. So after they're flying Spitfires off carrier decks with extra fuel tanks, because the Spitfire doesn't have the range to go from from Mallorca, where they could do the flying them off to Malta with that extra. They land on Malta, and the Luftwaffe just destroys them to the ground. Within 2 days, from 47, there are now two operational Spitfires. And this happened throughout the spring of 1942. So that's one of the strands is really the defensive strand, just trying to get defense to a point where they can actually defend themselves, stop the bombing. And the other, but there's also this offensive thing, that the fact is the reason they're doing this, why they're going to all this trouble with, is because Malta is so important as an offensive
Mhm.
base.
Mhm.
And it was first against Rommel and the war in North Africa. And once they win that, Malta is where we launch Operation Husky against Sicily. That's the start of the invasion of Europe. It's based in Malta. That's where Eisenhower, everybody was.
I see.
So I would actually describe that. But my book, looking at the period when Malta came close to being defeated, I have a torpedo bomber character, so that's to show the offensive side. I have then the intelligence piece. I'll get back to that. And then I have the merchant navy piece. The intelligence piece is divided into two pieces because I also have a woman who's in the a senior female intelligence officer with the WAP, who is sent to Malta because she knows about X and and all of that. So she's been in Bletchley Park, and she's now
I love
in
it.
Malta because she's a senior officer. But the Navy says I use for women shouldn't be in intelligence, get out, and doesn't
Mm,
allow her to take her position
right, right.
at first. So that there's that storyline is another it's a new woman character. I personally like her a great deal.
Well, I can't wait. I can't
And
wait.
as I said, there's basically four main characters, but the three RAF characters get interwoven very soon. The Merchant Navy goes along sort of as an entirely separate storyline until the second book, when it gets involved in pedestal. But even then, it really only comes together at the end.
Okay, okay.
It may be difficult. I may end up, if somebody made it, I don't know. I'd hate to take out the Navy piece,
Oh,
but
I hate for you to do that too, because I always learn something from just your research, and I love the fact that you're kind of moving away from you'll have the aviation part too in the flyers in the new book, I'm sure,
yeah.
but the fact that we're going to be learning about the merchant navy, and then also bringing in the intelligence aspect, that's exciting.
Mm.
That's exciting. When when do you think this book will be out? Like, how far are you in your writing process?
Way behind. I expect to finish, as I say, I'm doing the Navy line separately, as I did with JB and some of the others. And I plan to write the last scene for that this tomorrow, the next day.
Oh, wow.
And
Okay.
then then there's still the other three pieces need to go in. I anticipate having a first draft at the end of December. But the first
This, wow,
draft means
that's great.
then comes the second and third draft, and then to my
Yeah.
editor. I think I is maybe a reasonable time frame.
Okay, fantastic. Well, Helena, I am so excited for I'm going to call it a duology since it may not be, it's not going to be a
It,
trilogy,
the
right?
title's Voices on the Wind. Voices on the Wind.
That was my next question. I was going to say, is there a working title? And I'm writing this
Yeah.
down, Voices on
Voices
the
on the
Wind.
Wind, and then it'll be Assault and Siege, because Assault is the first part about the defense of the bombing, and the siege bit about the supplies
Ah,
getting in, sort of the two focuses of it. And I guess it's just I think it's best to just call it a novel in two parts or a two-volume
okay,
novel because you
in two
know,
parts. Yep. Oh my gosh, I can't wait for this. And I will be one of your first readers.
thank you.
And I will have you back if you're willing to come back on, and we'll make sure that we get. I kind of got into the Berlin, the Bridge to Tomorrow series through. I was assigned to review your first book,
Yeah.
and that's how I was introduced. And then later on, as you were already moving into Cold War, I was just like understanding, like, oh, hey, I could have this, this author on my channel, and we can discuss things. So um but now we kind of got on in the middle and towards the end of the series, but I can only recommend Bridge to Tomorrow to my viewers out there. It's a wonderful,
Yeah.
like you said, deeply character driven story, that if you just want to lose yourself in a great story, and Helena's a fantastic storyteller. I mean, you're just,
Thank you.
I keep the pages keep turning, and you really get invested in these characters, and you learn so much about the Berlin airlift, and just the fact that you can see where it, you know what happened then impacts now. And so it's a wonderful series, but I'm looking forward to your new one as well. Voices on the Wind. We'll have you back on as soon as I can,
Okay. It's a
as
long
soon as I
ways
read
away.
that first book. So you said next year, right? Maybe next
Yeah.
year sometime.
Right. Yeah, yeah.
Okay. All right.
I hope you'll write a review of Cold Victory though while you're at it.
Yes, I will.
So
I
you didn't get that, you didn't get assigned to it, so this one you had to do on your own.
I'm gonna do it on my own. I'm gonna do it on my own. I'm worried I don't want to give away spoilers in my reviews, but um, we'll see how I can do that. But yes, I'll definitely be reviewing it, and it's a fantastic story, and it was a wonderful conclusion to a wonderful series. So, thank you, Helena, for being on the
You're very
History
welcome.
Shelf. Yes.
Oh, do you want to give my website or
Yeah, I'll put up yes, I'll give what your website is. Tell us again, and I'll put up a
it's
slide.
Helena P. Schrader, all one word, .com or helenapschrader.net. The .net's got more, I don't know what
Okay.
you say, moving parts to it. And
Yeah.
then I also would recommend my Substack, which is hpschrader.substack.com.
Yes, okay, I'm gonna make a slide just for that. But and this is your Cross Seas Press is that's
Yes,
your publishing
right.
la label.
My
Um
imprint, yeah.
your imprint. And so folks, you can find this wherever books are sold. Just, type it in, and
It's also it's ebook and hardback, and it's as you obviously all major online retailers. So Barnes and Noble as well as Amazon or Kobo. I don't know,
mhm.
Google, all of them.
All of it. And all I can say is you're going to get your money's worth, because Helena does not stint. You've got almost 500 pages, and she includes historical notes, which are really helpful. I know when I finished reading the book, it answered one of my questions, which was, which events were real in the book or
Yeah.
happened in history and which didn't. So you've got all these guides to kind of, walk you through. So
Maps,
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 of
rank
course.
tables, yeah.
Yes,
Try to,
maps, cast of characters, forward, an overview, synopsis of the books that came before. I mean, this is a history and historical fiction lover's dream, just to kind of have all of these things in one volume, in each volume that you highlight. So thank you again for a wonderful series. I've
thank
loved
you. Thank
it.
you for having me.
I've loved the journey. I look forward to the next journey as we move on into Malta. So
Okay.
and
Thank
until
you.
next time, Helena, thank you for being on the History Shelf, and we'll see you hopefully next year.
Oh, thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.